Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, the third part of our Armchair Art Tour series, a nature series. Today, Wendy will be talking to you about landscape painter Tom Thomson and Algonquin Provincial Park. And if you don't know this Canadian landscape painter, you are in for a real treat. My name is Melanie Blake, and I'm the Director of Classical Pursuits. I'm here today with Samantha Clark, Marketing Manager at our travel partner Worldwide Quest, and of course with Wendy O'Brien, a philosopher, workshop leader at the Art Gallery of Ontario, Classical Pursuits leader, and lover of nature. I'll turn it over to Wendy in just a moment. I'd first like to very briefly review the features of GoToWebinar that you will need. There are two main features. Depending on how you're accessing this webinar through a desktop or tablet or phone, your interface might look slightly different. So for the first feature, the audio feature, you will see either the word audio or perhaps an icon of a microphone or an ear. Click on the icon or click on the arrow next to the word audio to expand the field, and you can adjust the audio settings to how you see fit. If you're having trouble with audio or any other technical problems, please send us a question through the question interface. I'll talk about that in just 1 second. And Samantha will help you as quickly as possible. And please do use that interface. Sometimes people call us, but we can't answer the phone when we are doing the webinar. So use the question interface. And so to use this interface, click on either the arrow next to the word questions or on the question mark icon, and a field will open where you can type in your question. And again, we'll get to technical questions as quickly as we can, and I'll be doing a Q&A with Wendy at the end of the webinar. That's it for the kind of logistics. I know that most of you know us by now, but we do have some new faces. So for those who are joining us for the first time, what are Classical Pursuits and Worldwide Quest? So we organize literary and cultural trips around the world. And Classical Pursuits also runs a summer salon in Toronto. Of course, we're not doing those in-person events right now, but we do have a lot of free and paid programs online for you. So as I mentioned, today is a new series, the Armchair Art Tours Nature series, and it'll have 3 parts. Next week, Wendy will be talking about Georgia O'Keeffe in New Mexico, and she wraps up back in Canada on July 16th with Emily Carr in British Columbia. So please join us for those free series. For a more interactive experience, we have small group online seminars. They are selling out fast, but we do have some spaces left in our seminars on art and literature of the Jazz Age, on the Epic of Gilgamesh, Albert Camus' The Plague, and classics of Canadian literature, Go Canada. And we'll also be announcing some new seminars next week, including several seminars with Wendy, and a seminar with Sean Forrester, who you may remember from our first Armchair Art Tour series. Oh, and we do have some spaces left, of just 3 spaces, I believe, in Wendy's Encounters with Landscape seminar. So you can find more information about all of these on the Classical Pursuits website, our online programs page. You can call me, send me an email, contact us, and we'll get back to you. If you are able to participate in any of these, we really appreciate the support. So thank you to Sam and Wendy for all their work, and I'll be back for the Q&A. Over to Wendy.
Thank you, Melanie. And hello, everybody. It's so wonderful to have you join me again for another set of Armchair, this time nature walks through the paintings of Tom Thomson. I have to begin by thanking Melanie and Samantha for inviting me to participate again in this forum, and especially the opportunity to talk about Tom Thomson. You're seeing one of his images, and one of, I have to say, my favorites on the screen right now. I have to begin by saying, well, I have to begin with a confession. Okay, it's not that kind of confession, but the confession is I've never done a workshop on Tom Thomson before today. I work, as Melanie mentioned, at the Art Gallery of Ontario, where we have a large collection of Tom Thomson's sketches and also his paintings. We're so lucky. I get to walk amongst them often, and are you ready? It's crazy. They pay me money to spend time looking and talking to people about his images. But despite all of that, I've never done a workshop or a session in a workshop on Tom Thomson's work. And I started to think about that today, about why that's the case. And I was so incredibly nervous getting ready for today. Thank you to all my friends who are out there who've had to deal with my crazy as I got ready for today's seminar. I've always kind of kept Thomson's work to myself, which might sound strange, but I have to tell you that once you use it, you kind of lose it. Once you use a painting to explain ideas or for work purposes, oftentimes I lose the beauty. Instead of seeing this gorgeous image, the whites and the blues, and hey, look at the colors in that water. Just for a few minutes, just look at the water at the bottom of your screen. You know, instead of seeing the brush strokes and the lines and the composition, and did I mention the color? Instead of seeing all of that, I see instead the person I was doing a workshop with, or the group that I was with, or I see all the reading. I apologize if I geek out. Or, you know, all this other stuff comes between me and the painting. And I have to say, I was a bit hesitant after I said I would do today on Tom Thomson. I went, what have you done? Because I didn't want to lose, I guess that's something that I have with these paintings. And part of what I've been doing the last week is I've been thinking about getting ready for today and trying to figure out in my head what I wanted to say in the short period of time as we go through this kind of nature walk in and through his paintings, in and through Algonquin Park. Well, I'm trying to figure out what is it that's special to me about works like this one. And I started to wonder if it's, you know, the color. What Thomson does, I know you're all going, wow. And this is at the Art Gallery, and I have spent a lot of time in front of this particular work. And the copy of a copy of a copy that I have on the screen just doesn't do these colors justice. Maybe it was something about the colors that he uses that inspires something in me, that awakens something in me, or maybe it has something to do, and I have to say, this is my favorite of all Thomson's paintings. Maybe it has something to do with the incredible kind of peace I get when I take a look at Morning Cloud. You know, the feeling that I get from this work. I don't know, maybe it's something about Thomson himself. And I apologize, I know this image is quite grainy, but I love it because it does capture something of Thomson himself and something that I find in his work. There is a solitariness and a kind of peacefulness in his work. And while I really wish we were here, I really wish we were all together in Algonquin Park to have this conversation, to explore his work. You know what? This is the best I can kind of do. You know what? I wish we were able to be in this place, but until it is safe and until we have easy access, we at least, you know, we have the paintings to help us. We have the paintings that let us travel with our imagination, that let us travel in lines and color and composition, if in nothing else. That let us inspire us to think about, to rethink perhaps under our present circumstances, our relationship with nature, to think about why it is that these places and these images call out to us so. That's part of the reason that I was so grateful to, again, Samantha and Melanie for inviting me to do these nature walks via painting through Algonquin Park. That at least if I can't be there right now in person, I can be there through the paintings on the screen and with all of you. But I think there's something else that I want to emphasize before we go any further. And that's the fact that, you know, I appreciate the paintings as well. There's something more here that the paintings can help us with, because I'm holding out the faith that someday, if not soon, but someday, we'll be able to travel back to these places, to this spot. The plaque that you see in front of the water on this particular screen is a plaque honoring this image of the jack pine. This is probably about the place that Tom Thomson painted this kind of iconic image that we have of Canadian wilderness, of Canadiana. And I was thinking about how, yeah, I was grateful for the paintings to be able to travel there when I can't travel right now. But I was also grateful because, you know what, when I get there, and I'm gonna get there, when I get to this spot, and when I have a chance to look at this pine tree where it sits over the water and over those amazing mountains, well, when I get there, the paintings will have helped me. Well, I think many of you will understand when I say that I'm always so damn busy, you know, busy on the outside and busy on the inside. And the amazing thing about traveling via paintings is it just like slows everything down. And that was me, not your internet connection. It slows it all down. You know, the busyness that I have in here as much as the busyness I have out here. The paintings, you know, freeze the frame for a few minutes. They slow me down so I can pay attention. So I can pay attention to the colors. So I can pay attention to the water, the rock. So I can pay attention. And so I hope with me today, you guys will join me in doing a bit of an armchair nature walk through this remarkable place, through Algonquin Park.
Wendy,
Yes,
Wendy, may I interrupt you for a moment? Would
of
you mind
course.
just moving your cursor off the painting?
I will. I can't actually see it. Is that gone now?
Yes, it is. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm always grateful for Samantha. I can't see what you see. I only see my screen, which is probably a really good thing. So I'm always grateful for Samantha for helping me out in this regard. What you're seeing right now is jack pine. It was painted, the sketch was probably done in 1915. It was painted as a full painting in 1916. We'll talk a little bit about Thomson's method, the relationship between the sketches and the paintings a few minutes from now. But this image has really become iconic. It's really become the image of Canada. And, you know, it's interesting for me because it's an image of us in the wilderness. And I got to tell you, most Canadians, for those of you who might not be all that well acquainted, do not live in places that look like this. Most of us live in places that look like this. This is Toronto, and our streets look like this. They are not beautiful, water-filled, tree-lined areas. It's full of concrete and it's full of buildings. But the reason I mention this is that despite the fact that so many of us live in places that look like this in Canada, that image of the jack pine has become so iconic, so connected to our identity. I find it fascinating. And it isn't just that we live in places like this in Toronto, but it's also that we now live in a, you know, multimedia. We live in a post-wilderness era. This is Michael Snow, another great Canadian artist that I highly recommend you look up online. A great literature, great couple of new books, one by James King that I can highly recommend, just out on Michael Snow. This is one of his multimedia images to point towards the fact that we live in a post-wilderness era now in Canada, and yet there's something about that jack pine that sticks with us. And further than that, we recognize now our relationship to the Indigenous population, to our First Nations people, in a whole different way. It's fascinating to me that Thomson saw Algonquin Park as empty, when in fact Indigenous people and First Nations people lived there for a long time, and continue to fight for their rights for this particular piece of land. This is Rebecca Belmore, a contemporary installation artist, and this is her work called Speaking to Their Mother, which is this huge, as you can see, horn, which allows people to talk back to the environment. And the horn, I like this image because you have a chance to see how big it is, and people have a chance to say back to the wilderness what they want to. It's true, despite the fact that we live in a post-wilderness era, despite the fact that we live not in wilderness mostly, but in cities, despite the fact that we understand now our relationships to the land and to First Nations very differently than Thomson did, these images of his, this one, as well as the jack pine, this is the west wind, becomes so important to Canadian identity, so important for our understanding of who we are and what we are. Now, that Thomson would spend so much time and paint images like this is remarkable and surprising. Here he is. This is a picture of him as a young man. It's remarkable and surprising because nobody would have anticipated that Thomson would become the great wilderness painter for Canadians, become the icon of wilderness that he has. Here he is, as I mentioned, as a young man. He originally studied business, first in Ontario and then in Seattle, Washington. When he was there, he began to study engraving and commercial art. And this is actually one of the images that he created. He was good at it. He was proficient at it. And when he finished and graduated in Seattle, he came back to Toronto and worked for what at the time was a quite prestigious, and would become even more so, commercial art organization called the GRIP. When he was at GRIP, he would meet people like Lismer, who will become important in the group of seven and the development of his ideas. But when you look at images like this, it's hard to believe that he would create eventually images that look like this. He was, well, he always loved fishing, but his relationship to nature, okay, well, his family read a lot of poetry, and there's a lot of nature poetry that would have been popular during his time period. But that he became such a chronicler of the Canadian wilderness is sort of surprising. And that he would create these images that would occupy not only the canvases in our art galleries, but also would so occupy the Canadian imagination is even more remarkable given the fact that he really only painted from 1912 until 1917. And during that time, he would create 400 sketches, many of which we'll see today. Many of the images of which are sketches that we'll see today. Sorry, that was not very clear. And 50 large canvases. That's an incredible body of work to create in, well, a little bit less than 5 years. Thomson's fascination with nature, his fascination more specifically with Algonquin Park, really began in 1912. Here we have Algonquin Park and a little bit of what it would have looked like when he went there. Now, Algonquin Park was established in 1893. It was Canada's first national park. It was designed to be both a recreational space and a logging space. Now, I know when I say that, for many of you, you'll go recreation and logging. But yeah, the two were put together as they were in many national parks in Canada, and I know also in the United States. The area was protected for those two activities, and the Algonquin, who were the First Nations people there, were actually moved off of most of this land, which was their traditional land rights at that point in time. The park itself is 7,653 square kilometers inside, covering great parts of the Canadian Shield. And I'll show you some more images of the park itself. We'll have a chance to wander and take a look at much of what it would look like on a day like today in just a few minutes. But Thomson comes here for the first time in 1912. And this is a painting done of him from that first trip by his friend, not A.Y. Jackson, but a different Jackson, Ben Jackson, who he went on this trip with, like I said, in 1912 to Algonquin Park. Now, what he went there, he went with his, well, this is very famous, this is his sketching kind of travel bag that he took with him. And you see there on the bottom, you can see where he had a chance to mix paints. And then you see the small sketches, how they were held in place in the top portion of the sketch kind of book. And this is how he would go, and he would paint what he saw and would paint what he would see. And what he was painting was, as I mentioned, this glorious place in Algonquin Park. Now, for those of you who don't know, Algonquin Park is here. And Sam, I'm just moving my cursor over. It's here in Ontario. And more specifically, we'll see it in just a second. It's up here in the southeastern part of the province. And the park itself is enormous. I mentioned that it's 7,653 square kilometers in size. And well, to understand this much space that was left open for, well, at the time the term was for primitive forest. I think what we would use now, a better word, would be pristine forest, though it's always hard to connect that notion of pristine forest with the logging that continues sadly to take place there now. I love this map of Algonquin Provincial Park because it gives you a real sense of the water that's here. Not only the size of the park, but take a look at all those rivers and take a look at all those lakes. It is enormous and full, and well, Thomson himself would spend much time there. You know, why Algonquin National Park? What was it about this place in particular that drew Thomson? Well, really good question. In part, it has to do with what you see up here, Grand Trunk Railway System. Right from the beginning, this national park was popular. During Thomson's time, it would in fact see 2,000 visitors a year that would go to the park itself. Part of the reason was technological in its orientation. When the park was created, it was created with railways that would allow you to travel to it from places like Toronto. So you had this population that was able to move north. And there were many hotels. There were 4 hotels right from the beginning in the park itself. And they were always filled. And you might go, wow, this is 1912. A lot of people go into the parks. But part of a bigger movement that was at hand. And that was a new movement towards getting out of the city. In 1912, for example, we see a big push towards the suburbs. If you had to work in the city, at least live in the suburbs. The need to have some kind of relationship with nature. And I would say even more broadly and more importantly, and something I think lots of us are experiencing as we stay home and as we stay safe, with space. You know, the idea that you could be in a place and there was lots of space. 1912, we saw the rise of this kind of ideology to get out of the city, to go back to nature. It was interesting as I was doing some research into Thomson, coming across some of the psychological theories of the day that said, you know, we were getting too soft living in cities and you needed to go back to nature, go back to the park, because that would toughen us up and remind us of who we are and of what we are. And while I suppose I don't agree with those images of mostly masculinity that we see underlying those views in 1912, it is interesting the questions, you know, going to nature to rethink our relationship to nature and with ourselves. Those are questions in my own work that I'm fascinated with. Why Algonquin Park for Thomson? Maybe it was part of this era. Maybe it was, as I mentioned before, some of the poetry that he read. For sure, he would have been familiar with Thoreau from his family and Longfellow's poetry as well. He would go to this place and, well, he would canoe his way in, sleeping overnight in tents and trying to find the backwater areas. And over the next 5 years, starting again in 1912, he would spend massive times going through this area. The amount of physical space that he covered over his visits there is remarkable. He would go originally he would just go for a few weeks in the summer in 1912, but after that first visit, there was something that kept on calling him back there, and he kept on going earlier and earlier in the season. He would go before the snow would leave, and he would stay until the snow came again. And he would give up his job mostly as a commercial artist, creating those images like the ones I showed you earlier. And he would instead spend all his time painting, hoping, and often successfully, selling some of the images that he created, which would provide him with money for the following year. He would spend winters in Toronto, oftentimes and very famously camping out in what is now the Rosedale district. For those of you who don't know Toronto, Rosedale is in a very exclusive neighborhood. His studio would be there, and he would pitch a tent at one point in time because he was so desperate for money. He couldn't afford rent. He would pitch a tent and he would live there. It was this area that drew him. And if we could be there today, I showed you this image before, this is sort of what we would be seeing. Okay, I have to tell you, there's one advantage of us looking at the paintings and at some photographs I have of Algonquin National Park, and that is there are no deer flies or black flies. It is deer fly season. It's not fun. He would be here, and it was something about this place that really captured his imagination. There was something about this place that kept him coming back from that first visit, that not only kept him coming back, but that really inspired him to paint. A little bit of the wildlife we might see, the butterflies, and yes, lots of moose. If you've never seen moose, it's a good moose sighting spot. And right now is moosey season, as we called it. This is sort of what things would look like right now if we were there. He would go in the early spring, he would stay through the summer, he would stay into the fall when the colors would change to like this, or are you ready? Hold your horses, when it would look something like this. Such a celebration of color, so beautiful, such an amazing place. This was the place that he kept coming back to, and he would come back to. There was something here that drew him, something that captured, I suppose, his imagination and definitely his palate. Now, some people might say it was the fish. This is a young Tom Thomson we have here. And yes, you'll notice the fish. And he did love to canoe, though he didn't learn to canoe and to paddle really well until he first started going to Algonquin Park. There was something else here. And I'm back to this picture, this photograph that really does fascinate me. He saw something, he found something in this landscape that kept bringing him back over and over. In 1912, I mentioned, he first went to Algonquin Park with Ben Jackson, and Ben Jackson painted this portrait of Thomson there. But, well, we don't have a whole lot of images of what he painted when he was there because, well, he wasn't really a painter before this trip. He was an engraver. He was a commercial artist, but what got captured on those canvases, on those small pieces, they're actually often wood pieces that he would put in that sketchbook and he would paint. There was something missing. And I have to say, I have new appreciation for this guy. This is A.Y. Jackson. And A.Y. Jackson would share a studio with Tom Thomson in Toronto upon returning in 1912 from Algonquin Park. And Jackson would teach Thomson. And as I said, I don't think we've had enough exploration of the relationship between the two and the fact that they did share the same studio space. Jackson, well, his images looked like this, and I love this particular painting by him, because it shows technique and it shows style. What Jackson, one of the things I think Jackson really taught Thomson was about shape, and it was about form. And without question, he taught Thomson about color, something that Thomson with his engravings and his images didn't know about. He didn't have that sense or sensibility about color before his encounters with A.Y. Jackson. And the other thing, interestingly, that Jackson would introduce Thomson to, because remember, Thomson went to business school, and while he did enroll in art classes and drawing classes, he didn't have what we would call a classical kind of art history or art background. What A.Y. Jackson did was he filled in the blanks. And most importantly, I think we know that Thomson borrowed from A.Y. Jackson books on Impressionism. Now, I know some of you very kindly are back with me, having done some garden tours through paintings a little bit earlier this spring. And I talked a bit about Monet. I did a session on Monet and his beautiful water lilies and on Impressionism. The thing about Impressionism that I emphasized was that, well, most painting prior to the Impressionist period, it was trying to capture the world, but it was trying to capture the world as it stood still. It was trying to, well, create mimetic art. It's called mimetic art. Think of the word mime, and you get a good sense of it. It was trying to mime reality. It was trying to capture on the canvas the world just as it was, complete with all its beauty and all its ugliness. What mimetic artists were trying to do was they were trying to treat the canvas like a mirror to show us the world around us. And Impressionists like Monet, what they did is, well, they upped the ante, as it were, from traditional Impressionism by adding, or traditional mimetic art, by adding two important qualities to their work. You see, most mimetic artists were trying to create images that were sort of like photographs, like the one you see in front of us. They were trying to show us the world as if we froze the frame for a few minutes. That was froze the frame. That was me, not your internet. They were trying to freeze the frame for a few minutes to show us the way the world looked. The thing that the Impressionists like Monet, but also we could include Renoir in this group and Manet, the thing that they wanted to add was, well, the world never stays still. The world is always in motion. And if you look at this photograph and then you look at this image, it's a reproduction of one of his water lilies, I think you get a sense of what he was trying to do with those brush strokes and the colors, the layers of colors. And if we were, this is from Paris. It's a photo that I took. If we were there, we could see the thickness of the paint as well. What he was trying to do is show us the world in motion. It's almost like proto-film that Monet was trying to capture, trying to show us the world as it is, complete with motion and also with light. Can't emphasize enough the importance of light to the Impressionist work. It's why they did water so often, because you could see the reflection of light. It's why you also see a lot of attention paid to skies and to clouds in their work, because they were interested in trying to capture in lines and color and composition, trying to capture in paint light, you know, the audacity of that task and their brilliance at it. Well, it's this kind of art, it's this approach that Thomson would learn from reading the books that A.Y. Jackson would give to him. But he wasn't interested in painting water lilies, and he wasn't interested in painting the landscape in France. One of the things that I guess I've come to really admire about Thomson, and again, it's a funny thing to articulate, what I've spent time thinking about inside my head and perhaps feeling is that, you know, for him, art wasn't elsewhere, or otherwise. And I want to take a moment to explain what I mean by that. You see, for so many people, for so many North American artists during this time period, the beginning of the 1900s, the end of the 1800s, art was always elsewhere and otherwise. It was always in Europe. It was always, in France and Italy, and it was always to be studied in those places and to be created about those places. One of the things I really admire about Thomson is he made sure that art wasn't elsewhere and otherwise. Art could be just where you are, in the place where you were, and that you could capture the world there on your canvas. Yes, like the Impressionists, complete with light and with motion, but you didn't need to paint those places, those other places. You could paint here, and there was as much beauty to be found, a different kind of beauty to be found. Like I said, the audacity of the Impressionists trying to capture light is, well, I think the audacity of Thomson to say, I will create an art of this place. I will show you this beauty, this unique light that we have in Eastern Ontario. I will bring it to the canvas. And I think there's much to be admired in his bravery in taking up this project. Whether he did it consciously or unconsciously, we know he loved this country. We know he loved this place right from the start. And so after 1912, well, he was able to come back to Algonquin with new skills and new techniques and new understandings. And he would come and he would come and he would paint it in springtime. I love this particular image. It gives you a good sense if you look at the top of one of his bigger pieces. This is on canvas. This isn't a sketch, a small, tiny piece, but a larger piece that he did. And you can see some of the canvas sneaking through in the top corner. But I think you get a real sense of what he was trying to do. He's trying to paint what this place looks like, complete again with light. And if you look at the water, always with motion. He would come to Algonquin and he would paint it in the springtime with images that look like this as well. And he would paint it in the summer. This is Cottage Summer that was done by him, the image that I showed you right at the beginning. And again, do you see the resonance with Monet? Do you see those brush strokes? Do you see the attempt to make the water move, even with a two-dimensional still canvas? And take a look at that sky, man. Look at those clouds. They are stunning study in light, in light. He would paint it in the summertime. He would paint this in the fall. And many people believe that his fall paintings are by far the strongest. Again, the celebration of color. And again, all credit to Lismer. This is one of my favorite images of him from the fall. And it is called Autumn. Sorry, that's me looking at my notes. Autumn Foliage from 1916. One of the things that I love about this is that you really do see that resonance with the palette that he really learned from and got confidence from using via Lismer. Glorious celebration of the fall colors in Algonquin Park. Here are some more images from the fall. And again, the one that I showed earlier, this celebration of color and form. Now, interesting, across his career and over time, he would get increasingly abstract. And something that we actually noticed with the Impressionists as well, it became more about the color than the specificities of the shapes of the trees. And we can even take a step further and look at this image, also interestingly called Autumn Foliage, and notice that no longer do we have the delicacies of the pines on the trees, but instead we have this just pure celebration of shape and of color. Oh yeah, Thomson would come and he would paint it in the spring and in the summer and in the fall, and he would also come back and he would paint it in the early parts of the winter and late spring when snow remained on the ground. on the trees in the way that you see here. Again, notice the change in the palette, but the same attempt to capture light and to capture motion and to capture the unique beauty of Algonquin Park in this regard. Probably my favorite of all of his winter scenes is this one. And I always just want to stop and pause at the sheer beauty of this. And if you've never gone snowshoeing in Algonquin Park or in other places around trees like this, it is, well, it's a phenomenal experience. And the white, and it is blue. There's this strange reflection of the sky on snow, on a pure white patch of snow that Thomson captures so evocatively in this particular painting. He would paint the landscape. He would also paint the animal life. I mentioned before, it's moose season, and here's one of Thomson's images of the moose that he found. He would also paint the birds as they were leaving. Interestingly, only one painting that we have of is of people, and I didn't include it because, well, one of his contemporaries said that he just couldn't do people, and it seems to be true. But he did a great, amazing job with landscape and occasionally animals, and also with the wildflowers, with the foliage of the place. This is his painting called Wildflowers from 1916. This celebration of color again and of form. Another one of his pieces on flowers. And again, notice the move towards abstraction. This one is called Moccasin Flowers that he did in this place. Some more flowers that he painted. He painted the flowers, he painted the wildlife, he painted the rocks. And I know it sounds strange to talk about him painting the rock formations, but if any of you have done some nature journaling, and I think we all should do nature journaling, as Melanie mentioned at the start, I'm a philosopher by training. I do philosophy of art, and I am interested these days mostly in philosophy of art and its relationship to the philosophy of nature. I find it fascinating, these paintings of rock formations in Thomson, because really, if you have a chance to spend time doing some nature journaling, one of the first things you learn to do is you learn to create the rocks and shape the rocks. There's Laws, great book on it's Laws is his last name, book on nature journaling. I'll include it in the handout that we'll post with the video of this broadcast, but it's where he starts. It's the first thing you need to do. And I wanted to give credit to his ability, to Thomson's ability to show us the rock formation with images like this one and also this one that he created. Without those rocks, the painting, without that basic structures, the paintings wouldn't be as strong as they are. As I mentioned, philosopher by training. I wish I was an artist. Somewhere between here and here, things just don't go quite right. But I always try. I try to draw, and I try to capture in words the images that I see, because they really does help me see more when I turn to paintings like this one. Not really a typical Thomson image, a very different palette, but I think he was working on creating those rock structures, seeing the structure, the foundation in this particular image. He painted not only the rock structure, but he painted water. Again, Smoke Lake, I find a kind of a surprising Thomson painting because, again, the shift in color. But if you've been up to this part of the world on a day that's sort of gray, the water does get this deep, dark, it's bluey black, not that bright water that we saw before. He was interested in the water itself and compare and contrast. I should have had these both on the screen so you could see his studies in water, in the color and in its movement with different kinds of light in different seasons. And then, of course, there are the Thomson skies. And I have to say, while I've been in self-isolation, I'm in Hamilton, Ontario, and I have a lovely home, and I am so grateful for it. One of the things that I've been really missing is sky. You know, I can go in my backyard and I see a little bit of sky in everybody else's house. And I don't know about you, but I miss that big open sky that we see when we're in places like Algonquin Park. I miss seeing vistas, being able to see into the distance. And how beautiful an image is this one by Thomson. His skies are absolutely extraordinary. Here, very different day, very different time of the year, very different light. But notice what he's trying to do. Again, look not only at the palette, at the color he's using, but look at those broken brush strokes that he uses, dabbles of color in between, and swirls of paint as he creates these sort of magnificent skies. This is a picture I took when I was in this area, and I wanted you to see what the sky could actually look like, the breadth of it, the layers of color, because I think it really helps to understand what his paintings were trying to point us towards, getting us to look at and look at carefully well, first in his painting, and then, like I said, if we're lucky enough to have a chance to go to these places, gives us some cues and clues to better appreciate it when we're there and when we're in person. He would paint good days. He would paint stormy clouds. This is called Thunderhead. Again, very different canvas for a very different sky, but that breadth. And look at the swirls, look at the motion that he's capturing on this canvas. It's a not well enough, I think, known image here that we're looking at by Thomson. He would paint storms on the horizon. He would paint morning. This is Morning Cloud, which I mentioned to you earlier, is probably my favorite of all of Thomson's paintings. I wish I could take you all to the Art Gallery of Ontario to sit in front of it, because it really does give you a sense of that expansiveness and of the colors that you have a chance to experience in Algonquin Park in the early part of the morning in summertime. Again, this is a photo I took there, and I was interested, and I'm just going to move my cursor a little bit, because look at the colors that we get up here, and then look at the colors that he's capturing here. There's something about mornings in particular in Algonquin that bring a certain kind of light that I think he was trying to capture. He captured mornings, he captured sunsets in the park. Deepening sunsets, again, is moved towards abstraction more and more as across his lifetime, more and more into this showing us motion. Interesting to the question of reflection in the water. More and more in his works, we would see reflection becoming an important part or element of his paintings. He would paint the night. He would paint the sky at night. And you know, we tend to think of it's black, but when Thomson looked at the sky, he saw these kind of layers of color. Again, you see the reflection of the moon there, but what he could do with paint to capture the night and the dark night. Here's another one of his moonlit paintings, and I love this reproduction. It gives you a better sense than some of the images I was able to get. And you can only imagine, we're looking at copies of copies of copies, what it's like to sit in front of these things and see the layers and see the brush strokes. But here he's trying to show us, yeah, at moonlight, that it's not just black and dark. Here you've got a moon-filled night where the world turns golden. I could look at this painting for hours, but unfortunately we need to move on. He would even paint in Algonquin. You sometimes have the great luck of seeing the Northern Lights. And here we are taking a look at his image of what the Northern Lights would look like while he was there. Yeah, he would paint the sky. And I think it was one of his focuses, one of his focus of attention. There was something about that sky that was unique in Algonquin. And whether it was the openness and the potentials that it offered, whether it was just its simple beauty, there was something, well, I came across in some commentaries the word enthralled, that Thomson was enthralled with Algonquin, with its skies and its wildlife, with its flowers. And I think that's as good a word as I can think of to capture his paintings. There was something in this place that enthralled him. And we see it here in these images we just looked at of the skies in Algonquin. But I think you see it here too, because, well, he had a total love of the trees. It's amazing. As I mentioned earlier, I think we have 400 sketches and 50 full paintings that he did. He would sketch en plein air. He would go to Algonquin with that little travel case that we saw earlier. He would go and he would paint in the place. Oftentimes when a storm was coming, something like we saw maybe something like this, he would run outside, and people who would travel and paint with him were always remarking that, you know, when there was a storm coming or a sunrise or a particularly beautiful sunset, he would rush out and he would do these sketches on these very small pieces, oftentimes of wood that he would collect from places. Rarely actually are the sketches themselves done on canvas. He just simply didn't have the money to be able to afford them. He was destitute during much of the time that he was painting here. He would sell a painting or sell a couple of paintings, and they went for extraordinary prices very early on in his career. But he would sell them, and then he would use them to try to live in Algonquin and in this region for the rest of the year. And he would run out of money and have to borrow and hope somebody would come along. He applied actually many times to be a ranger. He decided that it wasn't a really good thing for a painter to be a ranger because one would always interrupt with the other. He didn't get much painting done when he was a ranger, and he found that painting was way more important. So he would go to these actual places and he would take out these tiny pieces of wood and he would paint right away just what he saw. And this particular painting of the sumac tree is one of those tiny little pieces that he did that are extraordinary studies of trees. He loved the sumacs. Here you see one example, and here you see another example of a sumac tree. So many times painting the trees over and over again. Here we have, these are tamarack, and those are the yellow kind of images that you see in front of you. And oh my gosh, in the fall, they are stunning because you don't expect these trees to turn yellow. And it's an unusual kind of yellow. And I was looking at some of the photos I showed you a few minutes ago. I've had the great luxury to be in the Canadian Shield on the edge of Algonquin Park during this exact time of year. And I was remarking, I'll show you in a few minutes some photos that I took. My camera couldn't color correct for the colors that it was actually seeing. It was too strange a color and it kept on trying to get the right color. But Thomson does it so perfectly, this kind of mustardy yellow of the tamarack that were there. Here's another one of the tamaracks. And again, it's formation and color. It's all about the color here. He loved the tamaracks and the sumacs. He loved the maples, soft maple saplings in autumn that he's painting here. I noticed the red of the saplings here with the maples is not the same red of the sumac. His careful articulation, his careful attention and observation of nature. Not all reds are the same. Not all yellows are the same. And then there were the birch trees. These birch trees that line the shores all throughout Algonquin Park that really did capture something in him. I often think of that picture, that photograph I showed you earlier of him standing out sort of on a dock with the dog. And he was so tall and he was so thin and he was all dressed in white. And I have to say, just as I was looking at this image came up on the screen, I went, oh my gosh, I see, there was some resonance. Him standing on the edge of the water and these amazing birch trees standing on the edge of the water, thin and narrow with the white kind of clothing on them, the white bark on them. that there was something here that he found peace with. There was something special about these trees in particular. And all of the trees, of all the tree images he created, and many of the 400 sketches were of trees, as well as the 50 full paintings we have. West Wind is probably, along with the Jack Pine, the most famous of those images. Now, what is it about these two images that are so definitive of Thomson's work? And what is it about these images that became so kind of definitive of the Canadian imagination? Why is this and this kind of becomes synonymous with Canadian wilderness and Canadian art in general? Well, let's be clear. Thomson was not the first Canadian to paint the landscape. This is Cornelius Krieghoff, who in the mid 1800s was doing landscapes in Canada. What a gorgeous image is this. His images looked like these ones, images of Canada, again, of this place in space, not elsewhere and otherwise. He was painting images long before Thomson came along, as was Lucius O'Brien. Now, Lucius O'Brien was painting a different part. He was interested in the BC coast. These are some of the paintings that he did of the Canadian landscape. Very clearly, those are the Rockies. We're in BC here. And well, Thomson wasn't the first person to take the principles and ideas of Impressionism and apply it to the Canadian landscape either. This is Maurice Cullen's work, and I sort of think Cullen has kind of been overlooked. There were a group of Canadian Impressionists painting again the late 1800s, early 1900s, who, because of the popularity of Tom Thomson's work when it came along, has sort of been forgotten. We seem to believe that Canadian landscape art started with Thomson and then with the Group of Seven, but there were these earlier artists, and Cullen was very influenced by the Impressionists in France, using many of the same techniques, trying to capture, again, both light and motion in the images that he created. This one probably makes it clearest. You know, could have been Monet's sunset put right beside it, and it would be hard to tell which was Monet and which was Cullen. Sorry, not a very clear image that we have. There you have one of his night scenes. It's fascinating for me to put side by side up here on the canvas the Krieghoff and the Tom Thomson painting to see what had changed and what had, why it is or what it is that Thomson did, how he pushed forward Canadian landscape painting. Clearly what we see is kind of the loss of a particular kind of romanticism that Krieghoff still adhered to, and very much the British landscape tradition. If you have a chance to take a look at the work of people like Constable, for example, you'll see lots of resonances with this kind of painting by Krieghoff that you have on one side. The other thing that you notice is there's less attention to the detail and more attention to form in Thomson's painting on the other side. More notion of, I think, motion. And again, take a look at that palette. It is stunning. Also interesting to take a look at these two images, the Cullen version of Canadian Impressionism and Tom Thomson's images, how they're using those basic techniques and that basic kind of desire to capture the world just as it was, complete with motion and light that gets encapsulated in Thomson's work. There is no question that Thomson was influenced by these people, but he did something else with it. He took it somewhere else, and he would influence the history moving forward of Canadian painting. Tom Thomson is often grouped with the Group of Seven, often lumped in with the Group of Seven, but in fact, more accurately, we talk about Tom Thomson and the Group of Seven. He influenced the Group of Seven, but wasn't part of them. He came a little bit earlier, he was a little bit older, Indeed, he would lead the group of 7 to Algonquin to do some of their painting. This is a quote that we have on the screen from Lauren Harris, the unofficial leader of the group of 7. He said that Tom Thomson stands as the Canadian painter, harsh, brilliant, brittle, uncouth, not only the most Canadian, the most creative. How the few things of his stick in one's memory. Again, that's from Lauren Harris, who was the unofficial leader of the group of 7, who would push forward after Thomson a new kind of landscape painting in Canada. The group of 7 would consist of, well, oh, here we have Lismer. Thomson, as I mentioned earlier, actually would introduce the group of 7 to Algonquin Park. This is Lismer right here, out on an early trip. I think this is 1913, that Lismer goes out with Thomson to paint en plein air, to paint in this place, to paint Algonquin. Here, Thomson is with, this is Varley, as well as Lismer and Varley's wife that we have there. He would take them to these places and they would create, well, a whole new kind of art, each in their own style. The group of 7 consists of G.E.H. MacDonald. There's Arthur Lismer. We saw him in the boat a minute ago in his beautiful forest. Varley, who would push forward the kind of abstraction that we see in Thomson's work, in this work called Cloud Red. Sorry, I can't see the word underneath it. I apologize. It's Cloud Red Mountain. But again, see the consistency. We see the palette, but we also see the move towards abstraction. Here's Carmichael, Frank Carmichael, Frank Johnston, each one with their kind of own unique take on the landscape and on Algonquin itself. The group didn't really share any particular principles about art in common. What the group did share in common was their belief of making an art for Canada, about Canada, their strong commitment to painting this place and finding the means and the method to be able to do that. Finding both the scenery in Algonquin, for example, but also later on in places like Lake Superior, in Algoma. Some would go so far as the Arctic to Baffin Island. This search for the North and the belief that this idea of the North was important, these open spaces to creating a uniquely Canadian form of art. Here, this is Lauren Harris. And Harris, of course, was, as I mentioned earlier, the unofficial leader of the group. And again, the late abstraction of Thomson, I think, really influenced Harris. Harris himself was terribly shaken by the death of Tom Thomson. And for a while, really tried to imitate his work in both homage, but also as a kind of training ground to see what it was that Thomson had that he himself recognized he lacked. And I think, again, it's this move to these strong colors and this kind of abstraction to capture the landscape that he really gained from his association with Thomson. The group of 7 had their way of dealing with Algonquin. They had their means and measures for trying to capture its beauty. But I don't know, there's something about Thomson that is different in kind. Right from the beginning, I mentioned to you that there was something about his work that I find special and difficult to articulate and deeply personal. Something about images like this one that capture, well, maybe this was it about Thomson. Maybe what Thomson was doing was he was not just showing us the landscape on the outside, but showing us something of the landscape on the inside as well. Showing us the beauty that exists around us, but also getting us to feel that beauty with his colors and his line, with those brush strokes, those dabs of delight that we find throughout the canvas. Maybe he was teaching me to look more carefully. It's tough for me to know what it is that draws me and so many others to his paintings, what it is that he captures. Maybe he was trying to capture a moment in time, or a place that few of us could go to, that would be a place of our imagination. Or maybe he was capturing a place that was already undergoing dramatic change. This is his fire picture, a fire landscape picture. As I mentioned, logging was occurring throughout, and he created these images of the effects of logging long before we had the kind of environmental activism that we have today. Probably most famous in this is this painting called The Driver, a rare image there of a person, sort of, a couple people in the background, but just a sense of the loss of the trees that were there. Yeah, there's something in a Thomson painting that wants us to be there, or maybe it lets us be there, if not in body, in spirit, and in soul. This is Thomson's painting called Canoe Lake, and this is actually where in 1917, Thomson would, under very mysterious circumstances, die. This is a picture that was taken by, we saw McDonald's painting, one of the group of seven. It's taken by him very early on. He and the group of seven in late 1917 did a trip to pay their respects to Thomson. He was in a mysterious boating accident. His body was quickly buried here. It later would be exhumed and taken to the family plot in Leith, Ontario. Many questions about whether it was a boating accident, as people at first thought. He was a pretty expert canoeer by now, so lots of suspicion about who might have been. He was also a well-known womanizer. Many questions about his death there in 1917. Plaque memorializing him in this spot. What is it about his work that captures us? What is it about his paintings that draws you in, that keeps you there, that pulls you to this place, a place for many of you probably unknown, and right now unknowable to many of us. This painting called Great Day in the North from 1913, a very early painting of his. I found it fascinating to see this part here, and I have a blow up just of this. It's believed that this was actually a kind of self-portrait that he created of himself paddling across the Great Lake here. And I've often wondered what it was he took there and what it was he brought back. I wonder what we take to places like Algonquin Park, we take to nature, to the wilderness, and what we leave there and can leave behind, and what we bring back. As I mentioned, I'm fascinated with the idea of our relationship to wilderness. I'm interested in rethinking and reframing it. So here we are, back again. What is it about this that captures our imagination? What is it about his paintings that capture this place in ways that other artists, other landscape artists don't? What draws us and pulls us in? Now, I know many of you have probably been to Algonquin Park and probably have some answers to what is special about it. I would love if you put your comments in the chat section for us to have an opportunity to talk about it. I'm going to head here in the not too distant future, in the fall of this year, with our lovely friends from Worldwide Quest. We're heading off to ask these questions on situ as Algonquin begins to open up. We'll have a chance to take some photos of our own and do maybe a little painting of our own, to think about the group of seven, about their relationship, their rethinking of our relationship with nature at the beginning of a new century, as we towards the beginning of a new century, and definitely in light of all the events that we've lived through over the past months, start to rethink our relationship with it as well. I love this part of the world. I can't wait to spend some more time there and to think about Thomson's paintings in situ. this picture, I mentioned earlier, my camera was having a hard time because I was far away and zooming in. It's actually a photograph, but I always think of it, it almost looks like a picture because the colors were so vibrant and the place so glorious. If you have an opportunity, love to have you join us while we're there. But for the time being, we'll travel with Thomson till we can travel there safely. Thank you so much for coming with me on this journey through Algonquin Park. I would love to hear your questions, and I think Melanie's been monitoring the chat box so we can hear about some of your comments on Algonquin Park and your experience and understanding of Thomson's work and his relationship to the Canadian landscape. Thank you for listening, and I'm going to turn it over to Melanie.
Thank you, Wendy. Oh my gosh, this was going to be the year that after Toronto Pursuits, which was supposed to take place next week, I was going to spend some time in rural Ontario and rural Quebec. Not this year. So your presentation was a great virtual visit. Okay, so thank you so much. That was fantastic. So many new painters that I did not know about, and I'm sure same for you, especially if you've not been to the Art Gallery of Ontario, or you weren't as familiar with the Group of Seven. I hope you got some new painters to discover. So as Wendy mentioned, please do send your questions. I have several questions coming in, and one comment that I wanted to especially share, this is from Babs. She says, many thanks to Wendy for her insights into Thomson's work. She's been an admirer of the Group of Seven for a long time, for decades, but she says, this is the first time I have been so aware of the colors in Thomson's work. The selection and assembly of the pictures clearly illustrate Wendy's points and changed my understanding. So that's a win. We love it when we can bring something new and have somebody maybe even change the way they think or see about something as a result of our program. So thanks, Babs, and thanks, Wendy.
Melanie, can I just say thanks to Babs as well? I'm hoping you're still online with us. I so appreciate that comment. And you're right, it's about the color that so often gets overlooked. And once again, A.Y. Jackson and his influence, his kind of tutelage, and looking at some of, what he had painted prior to his coming to share this studio with Thomson really shows the color is important. And I wish we were doing this interactively so I could hear your comments and I could ask you, what do those colors do for you? There's a debate kind of in Thomson. He's sitting right on the edge between impressionistic art, which was trying to show us the way the world looked, complete with light and motion, and post-impressionistic art, which was all about not so much what we saw, but what we felt. If Impressionism was holding up a mirror to the world, post-impressionism turned that mirror around and showed us not the way the world looked, but the way we felt when we looked at the world. And he seems to be, teetering just on the line between those two movements. And I think color is part of the vocabulary that he's using to show us outside, and as I mentioned earlier, to show us the inside landscape as well. So thank you so much for that, Babs. I wish we could sit down over a cup of tea or perhaps a mimosa and have that conversation.
Someday soon, I hope.
You betcha.
And several more compliments for Wendy. Just people, thank you so much. Really, people really enjoyed it. And Wendy, we'll definitely share all those comments with you. So thanks to Margie, and I see Betty and everybody who has written in to say thank you. We really appreciate it. I do have a few questions about kind of the trajectory of Thomson's career. So I think this is Angela asking, is there a reason why he painted for only 5 years? Well, so we know he died in 1917. But what prompted him to turn from engraving to painting?
I think it really was. Thank you, Angela, for the question. I really do think it was when he went to Algonquin, because before that he was quite content with his engraving, and he did take courses when he was in Toronto. So he went to school in Ontario. He went to Seattle, came back and got this job in Toronto, and at the big studio building. Many of the people who have become part of the group of seven were also commercial artists and would also be located there. And they were always busy learning. They were taking courses at various institutes. They were participating in competitions at various places. They were very active members of what was the then newly formed Arts and Letters Society, which, if any of you have been in Toronto, is downtown on Elm Street and still exists there, has beautiful, beautiful kind of photographs and images of the group of seven and their time that they spent supporting that institution. You know, they were really interested in honing their craft, and Thomson took courses, but it was always drawing courses. It was always pencil sketching courses. There was something, I think, that really did happen to him when he saw the colors and the vibrancy and the motion and the real beauty of Algonquin. And when he came back, that's really when he needed to learn to paint. It's when he needed to push himself beyond. And so interesting, taking a look, if you have a chance to watch the video again, I've tried to include the years on many of the paintings, because those early paintings he did, even from 1913, his second time in Algonquin, you can see him struggling to try to find the colors and the lines to capture the place. It's something happened. I would say it was 1914 when he gained a new kind of confidence. Maybe it was just sheer experience. Maybe it was the encouragement of so many of those other artists who were working in the studio with him. But something happens, and all of a sudden, he's willing to show us not the vision. It's not that kind of Krieghoff vision, you know, it's not the Europeanization of the Canadian landscape. It's not the romanticization of the naturalist kind of image of nature, but there is something that happens to him, and he shows us, I guess he shows us his Algonquin. You know, he shows us what he saw and isn't so worried about the tradition. And to the point, Angela, I think that the fact that he lacked that kind of traditional classical art training where, you know, you do art history and you do the painting classes may have been to his advantage in some ways. He had what he brought, and that's all that he had, but man, what he brought, you know, for such a quiet man. I love to include quotes from the painters themselves. I like them to speak of and on their paintings. And the thing about Thomson is he was so incredibly quiet in so many ways. We have a few of his letters. We have the occasional line that I could quote from you. But really, he was a quiet man on the outside, but on the inside. And what he can say with those colors and those shapes, it's phenomenal. So not a lot of art background, but goes to this place, does this trip, sees something that he wants to capture, not just in his memory, but wants to capture on the canvas. And boom, man, it's really remarkable. I'm just taking a look downwards. It's not about you, it's because I wanted to be sure I got the year right. Already as early as 1913, he exhibited at the Ontario Society for Artists. It was a big exhibition in Toronto. And from his very first painting he put in there was Northern Lake, that picture I showed you earlier that has him there, very tiny, in his canoe, bringing something to Algonquin in his boat. That painting was bought by the Ontario government. Very first show he did, 1913. It was bought, I think it was $300 that they paid, which was an amazing amount of money in the time. The following year, he would exhibit Morning Cloud, which we saw, and he would also exhibit Moonlight, which I also showed you, which the National Gallery bought for $500. And they saw something that he was doing that nobody else was doing.
This is the National Gallery in Ottawa.
National Gallery in Ottawa,
Okay.
right. Yeah. Thank you for clarifying that. Thank you.
Just make it, yeah, no, just because we have an audience from everywhere today.
Yes, which
And
is so
okay,
exciting.
yeah, which is great. A ton of questions. I will get to as many as I can. I know we won't. So let me get to it. Kind of a little bit of a follow up or follow on from what you were saying, Wendy. A question from Julie, who says, "I'm thunderstruck about how prolific he was in barely 3 years. How old was he when he died?"
He was 39 when he died. It was 5 years. So 1912 to 1917 when he dies. So 5 years, 400 sketches. And if you're ever in Toronto, send me a note and I would love to show you our collection. We have a number of the sketches, which are very small. The screen that we're looking at is probably, that you're watching me on, the image size is probably accurate to the size of many of them. 400 sketches, 50 paintings, 5 years, 39 years old when he dies. And can you imagine, he was just really starting. What else he would have painted, you know? As his fame was growing, as he had more money, would it have jaded him, or would it have given him more confidence to go back to Algonquin and create more abstract images? It is, as you mentioned, in 5 years that he went from somebody who was an engraver to somebody who painted this way. More power to him. I don't know where he got that, but man, I'm grateful for it.
A couple of questions. Thanks, Wendy. A couple of questions about uh, his life. So since this was the time of World War I, Joanna asks, was he ever approached to be a war artist like Jackson and Varley?
Yeah, no, you know what? In 1917, he disappeared. It was 1917 that he disappears. He wasn't. He was older, part one, so probably not born in 1877. I'm not sure if he would have been eligible for the draft the same way because he was by then pretty much living off the grid. There's that question as well. So no, he never, as far as I know, I don't remember seeing any in the letters that we have of his, seeing any reference to him being conscripted or offering to go. Yeah, it was a very tough time. 1917 was really hard on the group of seven because that was the year that not only Thomson died in July, but Harris would lose his brother in the war. Varley would be off to become a war painter. Rough time for the group of seven, and really the coalescing of their notion of an art for Canada that would come out of both those two events, the death of Thomson and also the war. Harrison in particular, you know what, it's unfortunate we don't have more. As I mentioned, Thomson was not a man of many words. We don't have a whole lot of documents to go on, but we do have a lot of documents from Harris, and he does describe how heart-wrenching these two events and them coming back to back, what that meant, both the war and its effects and the losses that people were starting to feel and the death of Thomson. So thank you for the question, and wish we knew more about that period of his life, but we have a few of his letters, even those, and many of them have disappeared. So we're not really sure about what his views were on the war.
Thanks, Wendy. I have a question from David that actually goes toward the earlier part of his life, his childhood. First, just a few practical questions. Several people are asking if we have a recording of the presentation. Yes, we always record our webinars, and I will be sending you a follow-up email with the recording and some other resources. And a couple people are asking about more webinars or seminars on Canadian Impressionism and painters or other artists who have been influenced by Thomson and by the group of seven. So we actually, Wendy is leading a seminar next year in Toronto Pursuits. We are optimistic that we will have Toronto Pursuits again in 2021, in July of 2021. And she'll be focusing on French Impressionism, but also covering, I think you're going to spend a fair amount of time, right, on Canadian Impressionism and on some Canadian, on contemporary Canadian artists.
Yeah,
Is that
well, thank you so much for the encouragement about exploring both Canadian art and Canadian Impressionism. A couple of quick things. Yeah, Toronto Pursuits, hopefully 2021. I'm remaining hopeful and that we'll be all together. Yeah, I will be looking at starting with the Impressionists. Our focus for next year is going to be on pivot points. I'm going to use the Impressionists and look at the ways that their works and their projects kind of pivoted art in new directions. And yes, we will take a look at Canadian Impressionism and at the Group of Seven in particular. I'm hoping you can see this. Unfortunately, today I can't see myself, so I'm hoping I'm going to hold this up to the camera correctly.
hold up a little bit more? Yep.
Okay, can you see it? This is the big book called Impressionism in Canada. It's very big, but it's got the most beautiful reproductions. And what it does is it does look at the influence of French Impressionism on the generation that preceded Tom Thomson. People like, I mentioned Maurice Cullen a little bit earlier. I could have talked about Jack Morris as well. There was a group of people who went and actually studied in France and learned the methodology of Impressionism, the techniques of Impressionism. The interesting thing about them is that many of them continued to paint images of Europe and not images of Canada. And the uniqueness of Thomson was his real belief in Canadian art and Canadian art that represented this place and in this time. And so I love my country. It was Canada Day. Happy Canada Day, belated to those of you who are Canadians. But it is a unique kind of beauty. We have a different, and I'm looking at my own image on the screen here, which is this photograph I took just outside of Algonquin. And we have a unique sky. We have a unique light. We have a unique kind of forest, boreal forest here. And one of the things I love about Thomson is that he painted this place and the encouragement, as I mentioned right from the beginning, that we all can paint the art of our place. It can be here and now, not always elsewhere and otherwise. So we do have that coming up. Melanie mentioned we got a couple spaces, I think, left in workshop I'm doing online on landscape, and we will be looking at the landscape of Lauren Harris in particular, as we consider what it is that landscape painters were looking for as we go in search of paradise. And so those are just a couple of places that you can do that. And thank you for the encouragement for doing more on Canadian art. It is often underrepresented on the international stage, and trying to correct that just a little.
Trying to change that, yeah. So let me get to, I'll do Dave's question and a few more questions. I will get to as many as I can. Dave is suggesting that it might actually not have been so surprising that Thomson was associated or had an affinity with the wilderness. He points out he was a farm kid who did a lot of fishing, hunting, and sailing. At one point, he was out of school for a year because of ill health, and he spent a lot of time that year in the woods near Leith.
Yeah, and Leith is, thank you, David, and you're right, he was, and there are great biographies. I actually find it quite interesting. We have more biographies on Thomson, and particularly on his mysterious death, than we actually have on his artwork. But that's changing quickly, I think. But I think you're absolutely correct. He did have some that early growing up in the Owen Sound area and in Leith. He did always love to fish. And as I mentioned, his family loved poetry. He came from a kind of highly educated family. And David Silcock, in his brilliant book on Tom Thomson called Storm and Silence, begins by saying that, you know, he would have known the poetry of Longfellow, for example. It would have been read, and in all likelihood would have had some familiarity with Thoreau. It's just interesting that he leaves those places. He had a childhood rooting there, but he leaves those places for Toronto and then for Seattle, and he becomes a kind of city boy. But maybe, thanks David for this comment, you know, maybe we all kind of go back to those places that we found. And is that what he's looking for? Is there kind of nostalgia? Is that what I respond to in his paintings? Is it a kind of return to a simpler life? Those are really important things to think about in terms of what is the pull of this painting for me at personally, and I think for us as well collectively. So thank you for reminding us all about, yeah, his early childhood. If you have a chance to be in Owen Sound, Owen Sound is one of the most beautiful sunsets in the world, as photoed by Condé Nast. It is a glorious place. He did love to fish. He had some rootings there, and it's to that he returned. So interesting as to why. Thank you, David, for that.
Okay, just a couple more questions. Gail is asking, are all his paintings available in public galleries, and where are some of the best places to see them when museums open again?
Well, I have to tell you, Melanie, and I know this is going to make you sad, and some of you as well in different places, but in Ontario here, the Art Gallery of Ontario has reopened. We're under limited hours and with very specific instructions as to how to be able to participate or to attend. I haven't been there yet. My lovely partner in life is in a high-risk group, so it'll be a while before I get to see the paintings in person again. And I do miss walking amongst them and amidst them. But Art Gallery of Ontario has an amazing collection of Tom Thomson's works always on display, including that beautiful West Wind, one of the real treasures of the Art Gallery of Ontario here in Toronto. We have a number of the small sketches on display, as well as that beautiful, my favorite, Morning Cloud. I was taught that you can't say that you know a painting until you spend 72 hours sitting in front of it, actually looking at it. I know, geeks, we're a little bit crazy. But I have spent 72 hours. I did my hours in front of Morning Cloud, and every time I come to it, I see something and I learn something new. Also in Ontario, we have the McMichael Gallery, which has an enormous collection of Tom Thomson's sketches, as well as other works by the Group of Seven. Probably the best collection of works by people like A.Y. Jackson and Hassan, who was also associated with the group. And the National Gallery in Ottawa has a huge Canadiana section. I should mention as well, I mentioned briefly at the beginning, these places look empty, of course. There were always Indigenous people there and First Nations peoples. And be sure to take a look if you visit the art galleries as we respond to our Truth and Reconciliation, findings of the Truth and Reconciliation Committee, as we put into conversation the works of Indigenous artists with the Group of Seven to look at what was missing from their painting and other interpretations. I know at the Art Gallery of Ontario, for example, we have works with Indigenous artists intertwined with the works of the Group of Seven to give us a more complicated understanding of this landscape. So those are places, and I have to say right now, the art galleries in Ottawa, that's the National Gallery of Canada in Ottawa, the Art Gallery of Ontario, and the McMichael Gallery has an amazing collection of videos and movies and paintings and talks and seminars available for you online. So please go to those websites, and I'm sure you'll learn more.
And we did have a couple of questions about like the legacy of these artists. Can you name a couple of the Indigenous artists that, and I remember seeing their work at the Art Gallery of Ontario, that are presented as in dialogue or as intertwined, as you said, with the Group of Seven? Are there any that come to mind?
Yeah, you know what? I can speak to the Art Gallery of Ontario in particular because we have a new plein Indigenous Art Center, which has put some of, for example, Lauren Harris's works on one side of the wall. It's brilliant curation. My great admiration for my colleagues there who are curators. They have Lauren Harris's images of actually Algonquin and Algoma, which is in the Lake Superior area of Ontario on one wall, and the works of Robert Poole on the other side of the wall. And in between are some amazing wolves they're not Huel. I'll try to give you the reference to it. I'm gone a blank at the
That's
moment.
okay. We'll include it in the, oh, sorry, everyone. I know you can hear me typing. I'm sorry about that. I was just gonna.
That's okay. But you know what?
I forgot for a second. I was just gonna check the spelling of the last name.
Oh, Houle, Robert Huel. And
Okay, that's what I thought. I don't want to make a mistake. Okay.
there you go. And there were these amazing wolves that are cut out, and they kind of patrol the borderline between the very traditional kind of colonized image on one side and the indigenous image on the other side. Do look up, I showed you Rebecca Belmore's work. She's very much in conversation with the legacy of colonialization and its relationship between indigenous art and also more colonial Canadian art at the same time. I will tell you what, I will look up really specific names and send you some of those work. And also just a little preview, I've got a session on Emily Carr coming up. I think it's July 16th.
Yeah, July 16th.
We'll be looking not at Algonquin and the First Nations people and the First Nations artists from this area, but we will talk about in greater depth the relationship between Emily Carr's work and the works of First Nation peoples in BC, particularly the Haida. And we'll look at some examples of those two things up close and in person, and raise some questions about those relationships. Great concept that came out of commentary on Emily Carr was that there's a paradox of colonial imagination. And we'll try to take that on a little bit and discuss what that means in the context of her work.
All right, one last question that maybe will bring our audience together. And just before I get to that question, a couple people have mentioned, David and a couple other people have mentioned, Melanie, don't talk too fast, the Tom Thomson Gallery in Owen Sound. So we'll include a link to that in the follow-up. And a couple people asked about the Algonquin trip. We will put you in touch. We have your emails and your questions, so we'll put you in touch with Worldwide Quest if you're interested in Wendy's Algonquin trip.
And there's an amazing art resource center right in Algonquin Park devoted to Tom Thomson and to the Group of Seven. So yeah, very excited to be able to share it in that environment. And thank you also about the Tom Thomson Gallery. Got to give them big credit. They have provided me with so many high quality images. So for those of you who are watching, finding good quality images to share with you. I know, and I have to say the Tom Thomson Gallery in Owen Sound, thank you for making them available to us and for me to be able to share with you, because to be able to see the depth of paint and the brush strokes in some of the images we had today, it gives a whole new meaning and dimensionality, and it changes how we see and understand these paintings. So please visit their website.
All right, so yeah, I know I will forward your questions to Wendy if I didn't get to them. We have time for just this one more question, and I just clicked off it, of course. I think it was from Susan, I think, and she was asking, how do these works resonate with people who haven't seen the Canadian landscape? Sorry, why did I just click off this? Oh gosh, that was the gist of her question.
Thanks, Susan, for that question. And it's true. You know what? This is very much Canadiana. West Wing and Jack Pine have become images of kind of Canadian identity, whether people find solace or a point of controversy with them. Great books on wilderness and Canadian identity and art that surround and focus on these images. If you're not Canadian, who cares? Good question. I'm always very straightforward, you might have noticed. But I think it is a really good opportunity to consider, number one, how is it that we depict the wilderness, whether it's the wilderness in Algonquin, which is very close It's about 3 hours, 2.5 hours, depending on how fast I drive, from where I'm sitting right now. Or we're looking at Georgia O'Keeffe in New Mexico next week, or BC, which is thousands of miles away from where I am, where part of my heart always resides. It's what these works do, even if we haven't been there, is it does give us an opportunity to think about our relationship to wild spaces and wild places. As I mentioned, I'm spending a lot of time these days thinking on the question about wilderness and why is it that we're drawn to wild places and wild spaces, and the way that wilderness shapes our imagination, and the difference between what we imagine about wild places and also the reality of them. I mentioned before deer flies. No deer flies in painting. Just keep that in mind. If you want to go to Algonquin Park, we go in the fall for a reason. The deer flies are pretty much dead by the time we get there. But people, like they want to go. I do this even in my own backyard. I love being outside and in nature, except I hate mosquitoes and I'm not really fond of starlings. I'm trying, but I'm not. I think these images are like that. They get us to think about what is the call of the wild to start with. It gets us to think about our relationship to nature. Why is it that we're called to those places and spaces? And then, is this just a romantic idea, or ideal perhaps more accurately, or is there something more basic? Do we have a need for places like the one that we see on the screen right now? What does it do for that? So I think Thomson's work, along with the work of the group of 7, begins to get us into that conversation about what is this relationship. And more specifically, and I apologize for going on, but I have to just put it in there because I'm very enthusiastic about my present project, is the fact that I'm interested in looking at, and stick with me because I'm going to geek out for a moment, at the ontology of nature. So ontology is this crazy kind of field of philosophy that asks what kind of thing is something. So what kind of thing is nature? How do we categorize it? And I think it's a necessary conversation we have about how we understand what nature is, what kind of being it has, before we begin to develop platforms for activism, for example, because we need to know why we need to protect it. What is it special about nature? What is our relationship to it? So that when we develop kind of activist or environmentalist platforms, we have a kind of consistency in both argument and in action. So I'm very interested in trying to figure out our relationship with nature in that regard. And I use art, I use paintings, and I use poetry, and I use novels as a way to give us a place to develop a language, or the images, languages, whether spoken or whether in lines, color, and composition, to start that conversation, to reinvestigate and reinvigorize, I hope, our relation to nature. So that's what I'm working on these days, and sort of the driving force behind heading off to places like Algonquin and studying painters like Thomson and Harris, and poets like Mary Oliver, for example, and Louise Gluck. So that's it. Long answer. I apologize.
Thanks, Wendy. Yeah, so that's it for today, everyone. Again, we'll be sending you a follow-up email with the recording, and several of you did send in your impressions of Algonquin Park or your impressions of Tom Thomson's painting. I'll make sure Wendy gets those, and also include a sampling of your mini essays, which were fantastic, in the follow-up email. We'll be back next week going south to Georgia O'Keeffe country in New Mexico. So join us at 2 p.m. Eastern. If you haven't already registered, we'll have a link to do so in the follow-up email, or you can go on the Worldwide Quest website or the Classical Pursuits website. Thank you so much to Samantha. Thank you to Wendy. Amazing as always. And we'll see you next week.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Stay safe.